His name is too. And so I'll get us started with introducing some of our work, and then I'll turn it over to Sam. And so what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about what we study in our book, Christian Nationalism in the United States, and to provide some data that we've been collecting since then, and show exactly how Christian nationalism really does matter, both now and beyond 2020, as we try to think about where we are as a nation. And so when we look at the United States, and just recently with the Republican National Convention, I'm sure many of you were aware and heard about Vice President Mike Pence in his speech, where he said, and I quote, "Let's run the race marked out for us. Let's fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let's fix our eyes on the land of heroes and let their courage inspire. And let's fix our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith and our freedom. And never forget, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." That means freedom always wins. And so what was so interesting about this is how he was alluding to Hebrews 12 in the New Testament of the Christian Bible and 2 Corinthians 3, but he was substituting Jesus for the flag and making a really poignant example for us of how the religious right and many Americans really seek to interweave a version of Christianity that they would like to see privileged in the public sphere with society, and ultimately not only the symbols of our society, but our resources and our public policies. So this view we call Christian nationalism, and we look at this in our book. So quickly, trying to define a little bit of what Christian nationalism is, and then also how we measure it in our book. So we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework. So a cultural framework is a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealize and advocate for a fusion of Christianity, or at least a version of Christianity, with American civic life. And so we actually put an asterisk there by Christianity, because when they talk about Christianity, it does bring with it a number of assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and even militarism. So in this sense, it can operate like a dog whistle to a certain population, where it means people like us. And the us tend to be white, native-born, culturally Christian. So when we try to measure this in the American population, we generally pull from large samples of American adults. And we ask them a number of questions. And these questions, a couple of examples are, we would ask people to agree, strongly agree, or disagree, or strongly disagree that the federal government should advocate Christian values, or that the federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces, or that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And when we look at how people across the U.S. answer these questions, we can assign values to their various answers. And then when we add those up, we can create what really is a scale of Christian nationalism. So it isn't just about, do you believe the United States is a Christian nation, yes or no? But what extent do you think that Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere? And people can vary quite a bit. And so with this slide, we can see that across this whole scale, 0 would be all of those Americans that say they strongly disagree that the federal government should advocate Christian values, or that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And then at the other end would be everybody strongly agreeing with all 6 questions. But as you can see, there's quite a distribution of Americans all across this scale. And so to ease our discussion today and in our book, we assign basically 4 groups to different parts of this scale. So we have rejectors, that are those Americans who completely repudiate any notion that the United States should have a close relationship with this version of Christianity as its national identity or in public policies with civil society. Then we have resistors. And these are the people that are uncomfortable with the idea of Christianity privilege in the public sphere, but they're not wholly opposed to it. They lean towards opposition, but in some cases they're kind of undecided about it. Then we have accommodators. And so these are the Americans who are supportive of this idea of Christianity having a role in public policies in American civic life. And they lean towards that acceptance of this Christian nationalism narrative. So their support is undeniable, but it's not comprehensive. The ambassadors, those on the far right end of the scale, these are the Americans who are wholly supportive of this narrative, believe that the U.S. is and should be a Christian nation, and it needs to be privileged in the public sphere. And in order for the United States to flourish, this needs to happen. Now, when we look at these groups and put them together, you can see here the relative size of each group across the U.S. Our ambassadors are actually the smallest group, about 20% of the population. Accommodators are about a third. And so together, this is a little over half of the U.S. population who say and believe that Christianity should, to some extent, have a privileged place in the public sphere, in American civic life. Resistors are a little over a quarter of the population, and then our rejectors are about 22% overall. Now, we don't have time to go into the interesting socio-demographic differences, maybe in the question and answer session, but definitely in our book, we draw out how these groups differ and what they look like overall. Now, what we'd like to do is share just a couple of arguments that we make in the book that help explain why Christian nationalism is so important, and we want to understand what's happened in the United States and the polarization that's occurred in our civic life. So as we look towards the election, which is quickly approaching, we can look back to 2016 and also think about where Americans are now in support for Donald Trump. And our argument, one thing that we show over and over, is that white Christian nationalism explains support for Donald Trump. And that's over and above the narrative that we tend to hear, that it's being a white evangelical that explains support of Donald Trump. So let's draw this out just real quick. So when we gathered data soon after the 2016 election in the Baylor Religion Survey, and then a couple years later in the Public Discourse and Ethics Survey, we can see consistently that where you fall on this spectrum of Christian nationalism is a really large and strong explanatory variable for who you supported or if you support Donald Trump as president, and you voted for him in 2016. So ambassadors, over 75% in one survey, over 80% in another, supported Donald Trump. And you can see that decreases significantly the more that you reject or at least resist Christian nationalism in the United States. Now, what this does too, though, is we can see it matters when we try to understand the U.S. population as a whole. But what about white evangelicals? Well, in one data source, we were able to look at all white born-again Protestants. So if somebody says they had a born-again experience, which is a common marker of being evangelical, and if you're a Protestant, we see here that 81% of those in that sample said that they voted for Donald Trump. So this is really close to, I'm sure, what many of you heard in exit polling, that 81% of evangelicals, white evangelicals voted for Trump. But look at what happens when we take a step back and draw out our four different groups of Christian nationalism. You can see that among white born-again Protestants, again, the same group, it is the ambassadors and accommodators of Christian nationalism that overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump. If you were a white born-again Protestant who was a resistor, or especially a rejecter of Christian nationalism, the likelihood that you supported Donald Trump decreases significantly. And so to us, this helps, we think, makes it more precise to talk in terms of Christian nationalism, not just white evangelicalism. Because again, the degree to which you embrace this explanation that the U.S. should be and always has been a Christian nation really is doing the heavy lifting here. Now, among these white evangelicals, Christian nationalism is very popular, but not all white evangelicals embrace Christian nationalism. So it's an important point to distinguish overall exactly who was supporting Donald Trump and why. Now, we can also look across religious traditions. And so in this figure, I'll point out just a couple quick things. First of all, the overall story here is that as you're a rejecter to a resistor, to an accommodator, to an ambassador, you're basically more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Right? You see one group is different in that way. But notice all the groups, the different types of groups that stick together. We have white born-again Protestants, the white bar, white Catholics, or the gray bar, white liberal Protestants are the dark blue bar. And in that ambassador category, it doesn't matter which group you're a part of. If you are an ambassador of Christian nationalism, the likelihood that you voted for Trump is very high. And you actually look more like those three other groups than you do to co-religionists. So white Catholics or white liberal Protestants who are rejectors very rarely voted for Donald Trump. or they didn't support Donald Trump. And so they look a lot different than white Catholics, white liberal Protestants, or even white evangelicals who are ambassadors. So to us, this tells us that Christian nationalism, this cultural framework, cuts across religious traditions and even racial categories, but not to a whole extent. Because as you can see, and Sam will draw this out in just a second, for Black Protestants, it doesn't matter if you're an ambassador or accommodator or a resistor or rejecter. The likelihood that you voted for Donald Trump is very low. And so that tells us something, too, about what Christian nationalism is and how it operates in the United States. And so for that, so one last thing before I turn it over to Sam. When we look towards the 2020 election, and we ask people who they plan to vote for, again, Christian nationalism was a strong, significant predictor of who they said they would support in the coming election. And so as we move towards November and after, Christian nationalism will be an important part of understanding what happened and why and who supported which candidate. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sam to take us through our last two arguments.
Okay. So the second argument we wanted to dig into, and we talk about this some in our book, but what we wanted to do is we wanted to introduce some new data. So this isn't data that we showcase in the book, but it's a similar argument. So we argue that not only does white Christian nationalism help us understand why people supported Trump and still support him today, but white Christian nationalism actually helps us understand the polarization that is currently ripping our country apart. And we wanted to take two really prominent examples. I think the three most powerful things that are happening in our country right now would be the election coming up, coronavirus and our response to it, and also this issue of racial injustice. And so we've collected some data recently on how people are responding to coronavirus and the relationship that Christian nationalism has with that, but also on people's attitudes towards racial injustice and how that differs across racial groups, but also Christian nationalism. So the first thing I wanted to show, this is based from data that we collected back in May. So this is May at the height of lockdown restrictions and these government recommendations coming from media sources, scientists, medical experts about what you should do and how you should react to the possible infection from coronavirus. And so this is what I'm showing you here is the percentage of white Americans who said that they never took these precautions in the past 2 weeks. Again, this is about in mid-May, so we're talking at the end of April when everybody is at lockdown, businesses are shut down, and people are really supposed to be exercising these kinds of precautions. We see that as people move up the Christian nationalism scale, from rejectors, resistors, accommodators to ambassadors, we see that they were more likely to say, I never did this. In other words, the ambassadors were the least likely to say, I wore a mask within the past 2 weeks. They were least likely to say, I avoided touching my face. And I could show you some other measures as well, like I used hand sanitizer more than normal, or I washed my hands more than normal. But basically, as Christian nationalism increases, the likelihood that you took precautions to try to prevent infection or the spread of infection actually declines for white Americans in particular. Let me show you the flip side of that. What about the activities that you weren't supposed to engage in, like going out and getting into kind of interaction socially and not social distancing or getting out of the house? We see pretty much the same thing. So as people move up the Christian nationalism scale, they were more likely to, say, attend church when they weren't supposed to, or more likely to go shopping for non-essential goods, or visiting family and friends in person. That was something that they just weren't going to avoid. So what we saw is, and we published this recently in a study in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, was we saw this overwhelming pattern of as Christian nationalism increases, the ideology of Christian nationalism increases in the American public, it increased the likelihood that they were going to engage in behaviors that recommendations were kind of cautioning against, and they were less likely to do the kinds of things that people were recommending we were supposed to do to prevent infection, like wear masks, avoid touching your face, wash your hands more, and that kind of thing. Now, why is that happening? There's a couple of reasons. One of them is that just in the scale that we use, the Christian nationalism scale, there's the implicit assumption that God has a special relationship with the United States. And I think within that, there's kind of this assumption that God's going to protect the country. And if the country is going to be derailed in any way, it'll be because of our moral unrighteousness, not because we did foolish things and got one another sick and died from coronavirus. Another example, or another reason why this is happening is, and what we've shown recently in another study with Christian nationalism, is that Christian nationalism tends to be very much associated with distrust towards science and scientists, to be skeptical about the claims of science and to want to do the opposite thing or want to teach something else as an alternative to science. With that comes a suspicion of the media and also a suspicion or a susceptibility to conspiracy theories. And we're actually seeing that, I think, pop around in the media right now with responses to QAnon and those kinds of things. Christian nationalism tends to be susceptible to conspiracy theories, like everybody is lying and you can't trust anybody, so why follow the recommendations of others? But one thing I wanted to share, this is, we also asked the question, who do you trust during coronavirus? So at the height of coronavirus, we're asking people, who do you trust? And what I've done is I've split up rejectors and ambassadors, so people at the opposite end of the spectrum here. And I've ordered it from left to right, basically whoever ambassadors trusted the most. So look at the far left of that chart. We see the top three groups that ambassadors trusted during coronavirus. We're not medical experts or healthcare experts or scientists or the CDC. They come right in the middle. Who they trust on the far left is Donald Trump, far and away, religious organizations, and then Republicans. But what about rejectors? Those people who are on the opposite extreme, do they trust Democrats more? No. Do they trust some other kind of secular or liberal source? Not really. Who they trust the most seems to be local health department, medical experts, scientists, and the CDC. So what that suggests to me is that Christian nationalism seems to incline white Americans especially towards a kind of a tribalism that I think rallies them towards in a crisis like this. And so what we see is people taking Christian nationalist Americans, especially, taking cues from Donald Trump, religious organizations, and the Republican Party as to how they're supposed to respond during coronavirus. And I think that is what we would argue is that it may have actually contributed to the sustained advance of the disease and even the rapid spread of the disease, is that Christian nationalism may have actually contributed to that kind of behavior, leading to more infections. Something else we wanted to touch upon, this is, again, new data that we've collected. Christian nationalism is powerfully associated with how we think about racial issues. And in many ways, that's actually at the core of Christian nationalism itself. Remember, Andrew said at the very beginning of this talk, when people say Christian in this Christian nationalism formula, when ambassadors, white ambassadors especially, say Christian, it's kind of a dog whistle. What it means is people like us, and often that means white, native-born, culturally conservative Americans. But it doesn't necessarily mean that for African Americans and other people of color. Let me show you some examples of how Christian nationalism powerfully relates to our views about race. So this is the percentage of white and black Americans who believe that blacks face a lot of discrimination. And we fielded this back in August, so just a few weeks ago. What we see is that for black Americans, as they increase in Christian nationalism, it basically stays the same, whether they're rejectors or ambassadors. Roughly 75 to 80% of African Americans feel that black Americans face a lot of discrimination. But what about white Americans? We see as Christian nationalism increases for white Americans, we see a precipitous decline in their willingness to acknowledge that black Americans face a lot of discrimination. Why is that? Well, white Americans who are ambassadors are far more likely to feel that whites face discrimination or white Christians face discrimination. They're unwilling to acknowledge that black Americans face discrimination. This actually plays itself out in something that we're all looking at in the news right now, is our attitudes towards policing and policing reform. To what extent are police abusing and continuing to abuse people of color in a very high-profile kind of way, in a way that we haven't addressed as a nation enough? Well, we see that Christian nationalism very much so shapes our attitudes to police brutality. This is the percent of white and black Americans who agree that, quote, reports of police brutality against black Americans are exaggerated by the media. So the more you agree with this, the more you think they're exaggerated. Look at African Americans. As Christian nationalism increases, almost no change in their affirmation of that fact, or that affirmation of that statement. But for white Americans, look at that climb. For rejectors, we see less than 10%. For ambassadors, white ambassadors, over 85% of white ambassadors feel that reports of police brutality against African Americans are exaggerated. So it's undeniable that Christian nationalism for white Americans is strongly influencing how white Americans are responding to these claims of police brutality and this need for reform. The last argument that we wanted to get into, and this is where we'll conclude, and this is something that Catherine Stewart said, and I want to underscore as well, and I think we see this in our data. Being a Christian nationalist does not necessarily mean being a committed Christian. We don't want to confuse those things. And as a matter of fact, we often find that the two things are at odds. In other words, once we account for Christian nationalism, being a committed person of faith actually seems to incline Americans towards the opposite direction. Let me give you an example just from stuff that I've just talked about. This is the predicted value of precautionary behaviors. Remember those precautionary behaviors like wearing a mask or washing your hands or not touching your face, things that we were all supposed to do during coronavirus lockdown and really should be following today. We see that as in Christian nationalism increases, we see that your likelihood of engaging in precautionary behaviors to limit the spread of COVID actually declines. But what happens for religious commitment? How often you pray, you go to church, you read your sacred text? It actually increases. So once we account for Christian nationalism, being more religious means you're more likely to engage in those kinds of behaviors that we're recommended to do to avoid the spread of COVID. Let me give you another example. This is just a racial attitude. I would confront a friend who told a joke about racial minorities in my presence. We see that as Christian nationalism increases, your likelihood of confronting a friend who told a racist joke declines, right? It doesn't bother you as much. But what happens among the religiously committed? Once we account for Christian nationalism, you're more likely to confront your friend who tells a racist joke because you find that offensive, because it conflicts with what you have internalized about your own religious faith. So again, we are not necessarily talking about being a committed Christian. Being a committed Christian, as I would actually argue that people should be doing that more. It's being a Christian nationalist that seems to incline people to behave irresponsibly towards coronavirus, believe certain things or deny certain realities about the treatment of African Americans that we would hopefully all kind of affirm by now. So just in wrapping up, what are the implications for religion and politics in the United States? We need a new language for talking about Christianity and Trump, one that clarifies that for many, Christian is a political dog whistle. We mean Christian nationalism, not white evangelical, but we mean those who internalize that ideology. Lastly, we need to understand that many white Christian Trump supporters are primarily motivated by fear. Fear of powerlessness, fear of cultural degradation, fear of social chaos. Trump promises to restore an order that they feel like has been thrown out of whack. And I feel like that is what makes him appealing to people who affirm, those ambassadors, those white ambassadors who affirm Christian nationalist ideology. And with that, we will pass it on. Thank you so much for your time.